The smug vice president slid the termination papers across the desk, threatening to ruin my references if I made a fuss. He fired me to steal the encryption protocol I spent 400 hours building, using it as his golden ticket for a $10 million acquisition. He thought I was walking away defeated. He had no idea my code was not just static software. It was a living trap, and he just swallowed the bait. Hello and welcome back to the Boss Revenge Stories channel. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely no operating budget to keep producing the content you love. If you find today's story captivating, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where you can listen to exclusive, incredibly detailed true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot publish here on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code right on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link down in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, let us dive right into today's story of Riley Rodriguez. The air inside the corner glass office felt dense, artificially chilled to a temperature that made the skin crawl. Vance Sterling sat behind his expansive mahogany desk, wearing an aggressively expensive tailored wool vest that did absolutely nothing to hide his utter lack of technical competence. With a slow, deliberate motion, he slid the termination agreement across the polished surface toward me. I am Riley Rodriguez, 32 years old, and until about 3 minutes ago, I was the lead cybersecurity architect for this firm. Vance leaned back in his plush leather chair, lacing his fingers together. A sickeningly triumphant smirk played on his lips. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice into a tone that was supposed to be intimidating. He made it explicitly clear that the company held complete control over my professional references. It was a thinly veiled threat, delivered with the smugness of a man who thought he held all the cards. If I decided to make a fuss, if I dared to contest this sudden firing or demand fair compensation for my overtime, he would personally ensure that I would never find work in the tech industry again. His connections were vast, and his morals were non-existent. He expected tears. He waited for the inevitable panic, the desperate pleading for a second chance, or perhaps a burst of uncontrollable rage that he could use to justify his actions to human resources. I gave him absolutely nothing. Instead, I let my gaze drop to his wrist, staring fixedly at the heavy gold watch peeking out from his starched white cuff. It was a remarkably good counterfeit Rolex, but a counterfeit nonetheless. The ticking second hand stuttered ever so slightly, a tiny mechanical imperfection that perfectly mirrored the fake, hollow man wearing it. I knew exactly why I was sitting in this freezing room facing an unceremonious exit. It had absolutely nothing to do with my performance reviews or the sudden corporate budget cuts he had cited just moments before. Vance was orchestrating a massive, greedy power play. He wanted absolute, undisputed ownership of the Aegis protocol. I had built Aegis from the ground up, pouring my soul and hundreds of hours of unpaid overtime into designing a proprietary data encryption system so advanced it practically thought for itself. Now, Vance needed my name erased from the project completely. He intended to use my masterpiece as his ultimate bargaining chip in a highly anticipated $10 million acquisition deal that was rapidly approaching at the end of the fiscal quarter. With me pushed out of the picture, he could take full credit, present himself as a visionary tech genius to the buyers, and secure a massive personal payout. Vance cleared his throat, clearly unsettled by my chilling silence, and continued his rehearsed monologue. He declared with utmost confidence that the Aegis system was now the exclusive intellectual property of the corporation. According to his twisted logic, my continued presence on the engineering team would only complicate the newly restructured personnel hierarchy. He spoke of my life's work as if it were a simple spreadsheet he could just copy and paste into his own folder. He had absolutely no comprehension of what he was actually stealing. Vance thought Aegis was just a static block of code, a passive wall of defense that would sit quietly on their servers indefinitely. He was profoundly mistaken. Aegis was a living, breathing entity. It was an intricate ecosystem of reactive algorithms, designed to fiercely protect itself from unauthorized manipulation and hostile takeovers. I picked up the heavy metal pen resting next to the termination papers. Without a single tremble in my fingers, I signed my name. The ink flowed smoothly across the page, sealing my exit from the toxic wasteland Vance had created. I placed the pen down precisely parallel to the document. I stood up slowly, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my skirt. I looked Vance directly in the eyes, stripping away any pretense of corporate submissiveness. The smirk faltered on his face for a split second as he met my cold, deadpan stare. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. "I hope you remember how to change its battery," I said. My voice was flat, completely devoid of any emotion. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on him and walked toward the heavy glass door, leaving Vance sitting at his desk. His brow furrowed in deep, sudden confusion as his limited brain struggled to process my cryptic parting words. The walk back to my workstation felt like navigating through a sensory vacuum. The sprawling open-plan office was dead silent. I could feel the heavy, uncomfortable stares of my colleagues burning into my back. Yet the moment I glanced in their direction, they immediately averted their eyes. They were suddenly fascinated by their blank monitors, the arrangement of their keyboards, or the dull pattern of the carpet. No one dared to stand up for me. Survival in this cutthroat company meant keeping your head down when the executioner was roaming the floor. But as I reached my desk to gather my few personal belongings, I noticed a slight movement from the adjacent cubicle. Marcus, the incredibly shy IT intern who usually communicated in nervous stammers and rarely made eye contact, was standing there. He did not say a single word, but as he pretended to hand me a stack of blank sticky notes for my packing, he smoothly slid a small personal flash drive hidden underneath a worn leather notebook directly into my hand. It was his silent rebellion, a quiet, brave gesture of solidarity and farewell in a room full of cowards. I slipped the drive into my pocket, the cold metal feeling like the very first puzzle piece of my impending retaliation. My return to the workstation was a masterclass in efficiency. I gave myself exactly 5 minutes to dismantle 3 years of my life. My movements were sharp, calculated, and entirely devoid of hesitation. I grabbed a standard cardboard box from the supply closet and began my purge. I bypassed the Crystal Achievement Awards, the framed certificates, and the branded stress balls. Anything bearing the blue and silver logo of Omnistat Analytics remained untouched on the desk. They were meaningless artifacts of a life I was actively erasing. My focus was singular. Before I closed the lid on my corporate laptop for the final time, I pulled Marcus's flash drive from my pocket. It slid into the side port with a quiet, satisfying click. I did not execute a destructive malware payload. I am an architect, not a vandal. Instead, my fingers danced across the keyboard, launching a deeply embedded hidden command prompt, a silent script executed in the background. It compiled an airtight, automated authorship report. This hidden protocol meticulously scraped every server log, gathering unquestionable proof of the 400 hours of uncompensated, undocumented overtime I had dedicated to building the system. It detailed every commit, every line of logic, and every architectural decision. The report bypassed the standard communication channels and forwarded itself directly to the heavily monitored inbox of the corporate legal department. In all those meticulously documented records, the name Vance Sterling did not appear a single time. Once the transmission was confirmed, the script dissolved, scrubbing its own tracks from the laptop's memory cache. Next, I reached up to the back of my neck and unclasped the heavy black lanyard I wore every single day. Dangling at the end was a sleek, matte black physical security token. My colleagues always assumed it was a standard access fob, a simple tool to unlock the secure server room doors. They were profoundly ignorant. It was a highly customized biometric token generator. I held the device over the blue plastic recycling bin beside my desk and let it drop. It hit the bottom with a hollow, insignificant thud. They did not know that my creation was built with an intense, paranoid instinct for self-preservation. I had hard-coded a dead man's switch directly into its core root architecture. The system required a highly complex, cryptographic handshake, authenticated specifically by that physical token, on a strict, unyielding cycle. If the core logic did not receive that exact verification ping every 90 days, it would automatically assume a hostile takeover was in progress. Its defensive protocols would trigger instantly. Instead of shutting down, it would aggressively reverse encrypt every single piece of data across the entire server infrastructure, sealing the company's lifeblood behind an impenetrable mathematical fortress. I handed my wiped laptop and my plastic identification badge to the hovering security guard. I walked through the towering glass revolving doors and stepped out onto the concrete pavement. The biting Chicago wind whipped against my coat, but I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, burning clarity. I did not drive to my apartment to curl up on the sofa and cry. I did not turn on the television to drown out my thoughts. Instead, I navigated my car away from the dense cluster of downtown skyscrapers. I found a dimly lit, practically deserted dive bar on the edge of the city. The air smelled of stale hops and old wood. I ordered a cold bottle of beer and let the condensation chill my fingers. Reaching into my leather bag, I pulled out a small paper calendar and a bright red pen. I took a slow sip of the bitter liquid, uncapped the pen, and carefully counted the weeks. I drew a thick, deliberate red circle around a Tuesday exactly 90 days from today. A slow, chilling smile crept across my face. That specific date happened to fall squarely within the highly publicized closing week of the Omnistat corporate buyout. The timing was almost poetic. Later that evening, long after the cleaning crews had emptied the trash bins, the executive floor remained dark except for the glow of a single monitor. Vance sat alone at his desk, navigating through the restricted source code repository. He opened the master configuration files for my project. With a few arrogant strokes of his keyboard, he highlighted the primary authorship metadata. He deleted the text string that read R. Rodriguez. In its place, he proudly typed V. Sterling. He hit save, leaned back in his expensive chair, and smiled in the silent room. He truly believed he had just executed the perfect heist, completely unaware that he had just armed a time bomb. The first month of my newly acquired freedom tasted like salt air and expensive coffee. I traded the suffocating, recycled oxygen of the corporate cage for a sprawling road trip down the rugged Pacific coast. With the windows rolled down and the ocean breeze clearing the remnants of toxic office politics from my mind, I used my modest severance package to officially register my own boutique security consulting firm. I named it Phantom Grid. I did not need corporate endorsements or a shiny background check to prove my worth. The quality of my independent contracting work spoke volumes. Within a matter of weeks, my advanced penetration testing skills landed 3 major enterprise clients. Vance's desperate threat about ruining my professional references shattered into a million meaningless pieces. True talent does not need a permission slip from a mediocre manager. Meanwhile, back in the sterile, air-conditioned boardrooms of my former employer, Vance was greedily basking in stolen sunlight. He was standing at the head of a massive mahogany table, delivering a flawlessly rehearsed presentation to Helena Croft. Helena was the notoriously ruthless chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, the massive conglomerate ready to swallow the smaller firm whole for a staggering $10 million. She was a woman carved from ice and steel, known for tearing apart weak executives. Yet, as she watched the live demonstration of the protocol's data routing capabilities, even she was visibly impressed. The sheer speed and impenetrable logic of the system left the Apex delegation nodding in approval. Vance smiled graciously, absorbing the immense praise for a mathematical masterpiece he could not even begin to comprehend. As the timeline pushed into the second month, the invisible poison I had left behind began to seep into their infrastructure. Subtle, easily ignored symptoms began to manifest on the back-end dashboards. A yellow warning banner occasionally flashed across the administrative screens, plainly stating that the cyclic token authentication was missing. It was a polite, quiet demand from the system, asking for its master. But the fresh batch of junior engineers Vance had quickly hired to replace me lacked the intuition to dig deeper, eager to please their arrogant boss and terrified of appearing incompetent. They completely dismissed the warning. Assuming it was merely a graphical user interface glitch, they simply muted the notification and went back to their coffee breaks. They silenced the fire alarm while the smoke was already gathering in the vents. The only person who noticed the shifting shadows was Marcus. The quiet intern was digging through some obscure diagnostic logs when he stumbled upon a deeply buried, encrypted integer string. It was counting down. Panicked, he utilized an encrypted proxy network to send a completely anonymous email to my private server, detailing his terrifying discovery. I was sitting on a sun-drenched balcony overlooking the ocean when the message pinged on my tablet. I read his frantic description of the countdown timer. I did not send back instructions. I did not offer help. I simply replied with a single digital illustration of a bucket of popcorn. The show was about to begin, and I had the best seat in the house. The quiet decay violently accelerated on day 85. Without any warning, the protocol autonomously engaged its first tier of active defense. It instantly locked down unauthorized access to 30% of the most critical, high-paying client data. Panic erupted on the engineering floor. Vance's smug demeanor evaporated, replaced by a cold, dripping sweat that soaked right through his designer collars. He frantically ordered the entire tech department to work consecutive overnight shifts, screaming at them to bypass the lock. But they were wandering blindly through a digital labyrinth I had spent years constructing. My multi-layered, polymorphic encryption keys shifted and mutated every time they tried to force a brute entry, desperate and terrified of losing his massive payout. Vance stood before the furious board of directors and lied through his teeth. He nervously smoothed his tie and promised them that the massive outage was nothing more than a routine, highly secure maintenance upgrade. His house of cards finally caught the wind on day 88, unwilling to wire $10 million on blind faith. Helena Croft deployed her own elite team of independent forensic auditors to conduct the final due diligence phase. These were not the lazy junior developers Vance had hired. They were clinical, ruthless data analysts instructed to tear the architecture apart and verify every single line of code before the deal was officially inked. They marched into the server room, connected their diagnostic terminals, and started aggressively probing the core directories. By doing so, they reached right into the dark, tangled heart of the system, and touched the malignant tumor I had left waiting. The forensic team dispatched by Apex Holdings operated with the clinical precision of a surgical unit. They did not care about polished sales pitches or glossy executive summaries. They cared only about raw, unfiltered data. By the afternoon of their arrival, they had completely bypassed the sanitized user interfaces and dug directly into the bedrock of the server infrastructure. Under the harsh, unforgiving light of their diagnostic tools, an undeniable and glaring anomaly emerged. They isolated the operational logs of the entire encryption environment for 2 solid years. The historical record showed the architecture running with absolute, flawless perfection. It was a masterpiece of stability. Yet, tracing the timeline forward, a terrifying pattern materialized. Exactly within the last 3 months, a cascading series of severe critical system failures had begun secretly registering in the deepest background layers. The timing was not a coincidence. The catastrophic errors aligned perfectly with the exact moment Vance had altered the internal metadata to declare his fake authorship. The lead engineer for Apex Holdings was a hardened veteran with zero tolerance for corporate posturing. Recognizing the severity of the structural decay, he physically marched Vance into a soundproof glass conference room. He connected his terminal to the main projector, splashing the raw, complex source code across the entire wall. He turned around, his eyes locking onto his target. "Explain the core logic behind this rotating hash algorithm," the engineer demanded, his voice sharp and echoing in the confined space. The color instantly drained from Vance's face. He stood frozen, staring at the wall of mathematics as if it were an alien language. He swallowed hard, his fingers nervously adjusting the collar of his expensive shirt. Trapped in a corner, he attempted his usual deflection tactic. He started stringing together a rapid-fire sequence of meaningless corporate buzzwords, talking loudly about overarching strategic vision, dynamic scalability, and enterprise-level synergies. He confidently avoided the technical question entirely, hoping his aggressive posture would mask his profound ignorance. It did not work. The room sat in agonizing silence, watching a man publicly drown in his own incompetence. The tension in the air shattered into absolute chaos when the lead attorney for Apex Holdings stepped forward. She unlatched her heavy leather briefcase with a sharp click and retrieved a pristine, thick stack of printed documents. It was the automated authorship report, the very same undeniable proof my hidden script had quietly compiled and routed on the exact day of my termination. The attorney tossed the heavy packet onto the center of the polished table. Her team had spent the morning meticulously cross-referencing the cryptographic server stamps. The document provided irrefutable, legally binding proof that Vance had not contributed a solitary line of code to the architecture. The shocking truth was laid bare under the fluorescent lights. The $10 million crown jewel they were preparing to purchase actually belonged entirely to a senior architect who had been unceremoniously and highly suspiciously thrown out the door right before the acquisition closing window. When the revelation reached the upper echelons, Helena Croft did not just get angry. The legendary chief executive officer became terrifyingly cold. Her mind calculated the devastating impact in a fraction of a second. She instantly realized the catastrophic magnitude of the deception. If she authorized the final transfer of funds now, Apex Holdings would not be acquiring a revolutionary data brokerage firm. They would be purchasing a massive, self-inflicting encryption disaster, heavily wrapped in tens of millions of dollars in impending intellectual property lawsuits. A lesser executive would have instantly torn up the acquisition contract and walked away from the burning building. But Helena was far more ruthless and pragmatic. She saw a unique opportunity to corner the market entirely on her own terms. She summoned her most trusted executive assistant and issued a direct, unyielding command. She ordered them to utilize every available corporate resource to quietly track down my exact location. She needed to resolve the ticking time bomb at the absolute source, completely bypassing the incompetent management of her acquisition target, and she firmly resolved to have it handled long before the 90th day arrived. While powerful corporate forces began moving in the shadows, my personal phone started to light up continuously. The caller identification persistently flashed Vance's direct office line. He was rapidly spiraling into a state of absolute, unhinged desperation. I let every single incoming call drop to voicemail. He left dozens of frantic audio messages throughout the day. The first few recordings were aggressive and loud, filled with hollow demands and empty legal threats, ordering me to provide the master override passwords immediately. By the early evening, his arrogant tone had completely fractured. The untouchable executive was reduced to a sniveling, hyperventilating mess, literally crying into the receiver, begging me to save his career and his desperately needed payout. Sitting comfortably on the plush velvet sofa in my sun-drenched living room, I took a slow sip of freshly brewed iced tea. I opened my laptop and meticulously downloaded every single audio file to a secure, encrypted backup folder. I smiled as the bright afternoon sun warmed my face, quietly listening to the incredibly satisfying sound of a bully entirely breaking down. The ambiance of the exclusive downtown steakhouse was deliberately heavy, steeped in the scent of aged leather, roasted marrow, and quiet, expensive conversations. I was halfway through a perfectly seared ribeye when the heavy mahogany chair opposite me was abruptly pulled out. Helena Croft did not wait for an invitation. She sat down, her posture rigidly perfect, an aura of absolute authority radiating from her tailored charcoal suit. There was no polite introduction, no feigned pleasantries about the weather or the quality of the wine. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a thick, leather-bound dossier containing the acquisition details, and tossed it flat onto the center of the linen tablecloth. "Name your price," Helena demanded, her voice a low, lethal hum that barely carried over the ambient jazz. How much cash do you need wired to your offshore account tonight to unlock the infrastructure? I did not flinch. I slowly picked up my silver steak knife and fork, deliberately cutting a small, precise piece of meat. I chewed, swallowed, and dabbed my mouth with a cloth napkin before finally meeting her piercing gaze. You are operating under a fundamental misunderstanding. Helena, I replied, my tone conversational but entirely unyielding. The architecture is not experiencing a glitch. It is not broken, and it is certainly not locked behind a simple administrative password. It is executing its primary directive exactly as I engineered it to do. It detected a parasitic element attempting to claim ownership, and it is actively neutralizing the host to protect the intellectual property. Helena narrowed her eyes, her manicured fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat against the leather dossier. Everything has an override code. Give it to me. There is no code, I stated plainly. The only mechanism capable of halting the cascade was a biometric physical token. That piece of hardware is currently decomposing at the bottom of a municipal landfill somewhere outside the city limits. The purge is mathematically irreversible. A flash of genuine irritation crossed the stoic features of the chief executive officer. She leaned forward, the power dynamic shifting ever so slightly in the dim lighting, but before she could issue a threat, I placed my cutlery down. However, I continued, lowering my voice to a conspiratorial whisper, I can construct a highly specialized, targeted patch. It will temporarily freeze the defensive algorithms, effectively pausing the self-destruct sequence, but I do not want your ransom money, and I am not looking to derail your expansion strategy. I will deploy the freeze on one strict condition. You will proceed with tomorrow's acquisition signing ceremony exactly as originally scheduled. Helena stopped tapping her fingers. She stared at me, squinting in profound confusion as her sharp mind tried to calculate my angle. Why would I want the man who stole my work to receive his massive payout? I leaned closer across the table and meticulously laid out the rest of my plan, detailing exactly what would happen when the ink dried on those contracts. As the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in her mind, the hardened exterior of the legendary corporate titan cracked. Helena Croft threw her head back and let out a sharp, cold laugh that cut through the murmur of the restaurant. Her eyes gleamed with an intense, predatory amusement. She recognized a kindred spirit in the art of destruction. Right then and there, over the remains of my dinner, she pulled a pristine contract from her dossier. She bypassed the doomed data brokerage firm entirely and signed a completely independent, exclusive consulting retainer directly with Phantom Grid. The compensation was set at $2 million, effective immediately. Later that same night, the atmosphere inside the executive offices of my former employer was suffocatingly bleak. The eve of the 90th day had arrived. Vance sat slumped at his desk, the picture of utter defeat. His usually immaculate hair was a disheveled mess, and his tie hung loosely around his unbuttoned collar. He was staring blankly at the administrative dashboard on his monitor, watching the red critical failure alerts multiplying like a virus. Then, at precisely midnight, the screen flickered. The menacing red banners suddenly vanished, seamlessly replaced by a glowing, tranquil sea of green operational lights. The frantic error logs flatlined. From the comfort of my home, I had remotely injected the temporary freeze patch. Vance gasped. Lunging toward the monitor, he rapidly clicked through the directories. Finding full access restored, he buried his face in his trembling hands and sobbed uncontrollably, shedding tears of pure, unadulterated relief. In his sheer technical ignorance, he genuinely believed a spontaneous miracle had occurred, convinced that the system had somehow corrected itself and he had miraculously survived the storm. Wiping his face, a sudden surge of arrogant energy returned to his posture. He stood up, smoothed down his wrinkled shirt, and confidently prepared to select his most expensive Italian suit for the highly anticipated $10 million celebration gala the next morning. He was entirely oblivious to the lethal detail embedded in my code. The digital tourniquet I had applied did not cure the patient. The patch was programmed with a strict, inescapable expiration timer. It would only hold the system together for exactly 24 hours. The culmination of my calculated silence unfolded inside the most opulent private dining room the city of Chicago had to offer. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over a massive mahogany table draped in heavy white linen. Vance was holding court at the center of the room, surrounded by the entire executive board of Omnistat Analytics. They were actively celebrating their impending windfall, raising flutes of wildly expensive vintage champagne. Vance was aggressively holding the floor, eloquently rambling about his visionary leadership and the bright, extremely lucrative future of the company. From my position in the shadowy alcove just outside the heavy oak doors, I could hear the sickening clinking of crystal in the hollow, sycophantic laughter of men who believed they had just conquered the world. At the head of the table, Helena Croft sat with immaculate, terrifying poise. She took a microscopic sip of her champagne and allowed Vance to finish his self-congratulatory speech. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of her mouth. She gently placed her glass onto the table and raised her hand, signaling the impeccably dressed headwaiter. "Before we proceed with the main course," Helena announced, her voice effortlessly cutting through the celebratory chatter, "I would like to open the doors and formally introduce the new lead strategic partner of Apex Holdings." The waiter pulled the heavy brass handles downward, swinging the double doors wide open. I stepped into the blinding light of the chandelier. I was not wearing the subdued, practical cardigans I used to wear in the server room. I was draped in a custom, flawlessly tailored midnight blue suit that practically radiated power and absolute control. My posture was rigid, my expression a mask of pure, unadulterated ice. I walked slowly into the room, my heels clicking sharply against the polished, hardwood floor, instantly dominating the atmospheric pressure of the space. Vance froze. The arrogant, self-satisfied grin violently melted off his face, replaced by a mask of sheer, uncomprehending horror. The delicate stem of his crystal champagne flute snapped in his suddenly weak grip. The glass shattered against the edge of the table, sending a cascade of expensive alcohol and jagged shards crashing down onto the plush carpet. The room plunged into a suffocating, absolute silence. Helena did not even blink at the disruption. She stood up, smoothing the front of her blazer. She looked directly at the bewildered faces of the Omnistat board of directors and delivered the killing blow with the casual indifference of someone ordering a coffee. "Apex Holdings will not be acquiring Omnistat Analytics for $10 million, Helena stated, her words landing like physical strikes. "In fact, we have decided to significantly restructure the terms of this acquisition. We will only be purchasing your physical server hardware at standard depreciated scrap value. You see, the actual soul of your operation, the Aegis software architecture, does not belong to you. We have already bypassed your firm entirely and purchased the exclusive intellectual property rights directly from its true creator and legal owner, Miss Riley Rodriguez." Mouths hung open around the table before a single executive could formulate a coherent objection. The grand-grandfather clock in the corner of the dining room began to chime. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. The absolute threshold of the 90th day had been crossed. My temporary 24-hour digital tourniquet instantly evaporated into the ether, in perfectly synchronized chaos. Every single cellular phone belonging to the Omnistat directors began to violently vibrate and ring. The shrill, panic-inducing tones of emergency server alerts filled the dining room. Executives fumbled with their pockets, their faces draining of blood as they read the automated nightmare scrolling across their screens. The entire infrastructure had collapsed. The defensive protocol had permanently encrypted every single kilobyte of their highly sensitive client data. The magnificent empire they thought they were selling had just been reduced to an empty, worthless shell in a matter of seconds. Vance snapped. The reality of his total destruction finally fractured his mind. He let out a primal, guttural scream of absolute rage and lunged violently across the room toward me, his hands outstretched to claw at my face. He never made it past the second step. Two massive, suited bodyguards belonging to Helena Croft materialized from the shadows of the room. They intercepted Vance with brutal efficiency, slamming him hard down into a wooden dining chair and pinning his shoulders in place. I walked slowly toward him, stopping just out of his reach. I looked down at his pathetic, sweating face. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer and pulled out my mobile phone. With a single tap of my finger, I maximized the volume and hit play on the audio file I had saved yesterday. The crisp, clear acoustics of the VIP room perfectly broadcasted the high-pitched, hyperventilating sobs of Vance Sterling. The entire board of directors sat frozen in shock as they listened to their supposedly fearless leader crying, violently weeping, and begging me to give him the password to save his miserable career. I let the recording play in its entirety, allowing every single whimpering plea to echo off the walls, systematically atomizing the very last microscopic shred of his professional dignity. I pressed stop and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The Omnistat directors slowly turned their gazes from their phones toward Vance. The shock in their eyes was rapidly hardening into pure, homicidal fury. They realized in real time that this sniveling, incompetent man had not only cost them a $10 million payout, but had also single-handedly guaranteed they would be facing massive federal indictments for investor fraud. The chairman of the board stood up, his hands shaking with rage. He did not yell. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Vance's chest. "You are completely finished. Vance, you are fired. Effective this exact second. Do not even think about stepping foot in the building tomorrow." I did not stay to watch the rest of the bloodbath. I simply turned on my heel and walked toward the exit. I did not bother to spare a single backward glance at the pale, ruined face of the man who had confidently threatened to control my professional references. He was a ghost, a pathetic footnote in my newly built empire. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the crisp, freezing Chicago night. The cold air filled my lungs, tasting sweeter than any champagne. I slid my hand into my coat pocket, my fingers brushing against the crisp edge of the $2 million consulting check resting inside. A wide, genuine smile spread across my face as I walked confidently toward the sleek black town car waiting for me at the curb. Thank you so very much for staying with me and listening to this incredible story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's journey of corporate justice satisfying, please consider helping us keep this community alive. You can support our work by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon, where you can listen to our very best, highly detailed, exclusive true stories that are simply too intense for us to publish on YouTube. Just scan the QR code on your screen or use the Patreon link provided in the video description and pinned comment. Stay strong, never let anyone steal your worth, and I will see you in the next story.